Yo, what's good, Jets Nation? This is NY Jets Media, and I got Matt O'Leary joining me in this episode of the Position Breakdown, and we are both going to get into the offensive line. If you guys have not checked out Matt O'Leary's channel, he posts all Jets YouTube content, and his channel will be linked in the bio down below. So in this one, we're going to be breaking down the offensive line. So Matt, what are your initial thoughts on the offensive line as a group in general?
Yeah, so going into the offseason, it was definitely like one of the biggest needs on this team to improve. And I think Joe Douglas did a relatively good job of attacking that in both free agency and the draft. He added a bunch of depth. I don't know if there's necessarily like a superstar on this line. Maybe you're hoping Mekhi Becton becomes that, but I think he did a lot of good pieces to add depth to a unit that was really, really bad. So overall, I thought, it was pretty solid offseason.
Yeah, exactly. Because we all saw what happened last year with the Jets offensive line. We had so many different sets, and it was just absolutely atrocious. And seeing Joe Douglas had his first offseason to get his hands on this offensive line, and I like what he did. He signed quality depth players in free agency. I remember going into free agency, not all Jets fans, but we were thinking, all right, we're going to get Conklin, or we're going to be spending big-time money on these players, but that's not what Douglas did, as we saw. We got George Fant, and then we're going to get into our mine and Matt's individual take on each player. And then, so this is our depth chart that we brought up. So we're going to be starting off with left tackle, Mekhi Becton. We're going to think rookie, he's going to start probably because George Fant says he's more comfortable on the left side, but I think Mekhi Becton should be on that left side. You agree?
Yeah, 100%. I know that Fant kind of wants to play on the left side, but when you go out and draft somebody like Becton, you don't mess around. You just plug him in on the left, and Fant could compete with Chuma Doga, I think, for the right tackle starting job.
Yeah, exactly. So Mekhi Becton, getting into him, he is a massive human being, as we know. I remember when we initially drafted him, it was him or Tristan Wirfs on the board, and I didn't really know who I wanted. I just know I wanted either of them. And looking back, look at Mekhi Becton. His potential, as you know, is so high because of his. We've never seen somebody that big play that position, so it's a big question mark. But I think his rookie year, left tackles are not going to dominate immediately, as we know. So it's going to be he's going to get beat a lot of times. He's versing a lot of premium edge rushers too. So I'm hoping he can dominate in the run game, but I'm hoping he can develop into a long-term answer at that left tackle position. Do you think he's going to be that long-term answer?
Yeah, I expect him to. I think the worry with Mekhi Becton is his size, but that's also one of his biggest strengths too. So he's a high ceiling player, but there is a potential for a low floor. So it's a little bit of a risky pick, but I trust Joe Douglas's judgment when it comes to offensive linemen. So I was fine with it. Realistically, going into the draft, my take was if they come away with one of the four big tackles in the draft, then it was a success. And they did just that. So it's really hard for me to complain. I like Tristan Wirfs as a prospect a lot. I also like Becton. It was kind of a toss-up for me with who I really wanted. But at the end of the day, I think there are going to be some bumps in the road, especially in year one and early in his career, like we saw. Even with like DeBrickashaw Ferguson, it took him like a year or two before he got really into that Pro Bowl caliber player that we, knew him to develop into. So year one might be a little bit tricky, but I think eventually this is someone who should be a building block on the offense.
Yeah, I mean, let's hope he becomes our next DeBrick, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That'd make life so much easier for
Yeah,
Sam.
really. So going into the left guard, we're going to have Alex Lewis starting at left guard position. So what are your thoughts on Alex Lewis?
Yeah, I mean, they traded for him last year, and I thought he was pretty good at guard. I think sometimes he get a little too physical and get some dumb penalties at times, but I thought he was one of the Jets' better starting offensive linemen last year. They brought him back on a relatively reasonable price, and I think him being, in between Becton and the center, who we're going to talk about next, and kind of McGovern, I'm sure, is going to make him a little bit more comfortable in terms of who he's playing with because they're much better players than Calvin Beachum and Jonathan Harrison or Ryan Khalil.
And last year, when Kalichi Assembly went down, he got plugged in, and all of a sudden, Alex Lewis is our best offensive lineman. To me, it felt like he brought that physicality. He has that energy. You can see he loves to win. He just looks like a Joe Douglas offensive lineman to me. And you can
Totally.
tell he what was a seventh round pick he gave out for Alex Lewis, and he brought him in, and obviously Joe Douglas loved him enough to give him a 3-year deal. So I love that signing from Joe Douglas. I think he's going to be more of a depth player moving forward, but this year he's probably going to start at left guard, and hopefully he can solidify that position. So moving on to center, we got new guy in the free agency, Connor McGovern from the Denver Broncos. So this was one of the best signings, I think, in the free agency. So let's hear your thoughts on Connor McGovern.
Yeah, I think this is a really good value deal for what Joe Douglas was able to get him for also, because we know how much of a need center has been pretty much since Nick Mangold retired. They haven't really had a solution. They've had a couple plug and play guys. I mean, Spencer Long was a big swing and a miss last year or 2 years ago, whenever it was they brought him in. And then I understand the Ryan Khalil swing. It just didn't work out at all. And ultimately they had to do something. I thought maybe they would address it in the draft, but they went out and got arguably the best center free agent on the market. I thought it was a really good move.
Yeah, absolutely. Going into free agency, I knew center was the biggest need. I didn't know if we are going to get it in the draft or not. And then when we signed Connor McGovern, I realized I saw a stat where he didn't have one holding penalty all year in 2019. Did you see that? I'm pretty sure I saw
Yeah,
it.
I did see that. He's a really steady player in terms of not producing penalties, which I think is big for this Jets team because that was one of their weaknesses last year.
Exactly. And center is arguably one of the most important positions on that line because he's the center of it. He's communicating to everybody, getting everybody lined up. So it's good that we got that guy. I'm hoping because like you said, we have not had a solid center since Nick Mangold. And ever since Nick Mangold retired, this Jets offensive line has been so terrible. And I don't even want to get into the previous offensive line. So I love that signing from Joe Douglas, and so far, this offensive line definitely is a huge upgrade from last year. So going into our right guard, another free agent signing from Joe Douglas, Greg Van Roten from the Carolina Panthers. So what are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, I like him a lot. He's definitely an upgrade over Brian Winters, who we'll get into when we talk about the depth. But, he's a starting caliber offensive lineman that they got relatively cheap on that contract. He's a Long Island kid like me, so I always got to have some love for him. But he's definitely an improvement to that line. And again, that kind of fits the mold of what Joe Douglas was doing, just bringing in solid depth kind of guys and expanding, what you really have on the offensive line.
Yeah, and that's what Joe Douglas's philosophy was in free agency. Like I mentioned earlier, he really wanted to get cheap guys that been in the league, he's veteran, and he understands the position. Going into if we're gonna put all our money into like a Conklin, then we can't get all these other guys. And like he understands the value of depth. And the injuries we saw in 2019 just shows how like worrisome it is for Jets fans, even on defense, offensive line. There's so many injuries. So I feel like Joe Douglas really has a long-term plan of we have to be prepared for injuries. And in my last episode, when I broke down the middle linebackers, I mentioned that Joe Douglas, he signed so many middle linebackers, but the reason he's doing it is because he understands value and depth. And I feel like we haven't had that in GM in a while. He's usually McHagan is looking short term. All right, what am I going to do for this year? Joe Douglas is forward thinking, and that's finally a good thing for the Jets. So yeah, I love that signing from Greg Van Roten. He's a Long Islander like myself too, and he grew up a Jets fan. So another locker room guy and a veteran. So you can't really complain. He's not going to be a star. He's not going to be the best guy, but he's a solid rock and he's a veteran. So I like that signing as well.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Oh, yeah. So going into the last position on the offensive line, which is the right tackle, George Fant from the Seattle Seahawks. So what are your thoughts on him?
This is probably the spot that I'm the least comfortable with. I think that Fant, he has potential and there's a lot of raw ability that they see in him. That's why they decided to bring him in. But he didn't really play a ton in Seattle, and he seemed to play as many snaps as a swing tackle / tight end, whatever you want to call what his role was there. There were some games, especially against the 49ers. I remember seeing some tape where he looked like he was able to hold his own against the Nick Bosa's of the world and stuff like that, which is definitely promising. But if I had to pick one spot on the line that I was probably the least comfortable with, it's probably right tackle.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I remember when free agency initially started and all Jets fans were refreshing Twitter, who are we going to get? Who are we going to get? And George Fant is the first guy to get signed. And all of us were like, whoa, what, George Fant? And then looking more into it, is he going to be our left tackle? He gave him a decent amount of money, but then you look into the contract, we can escape it after this year. So he's an athletic guy, like you said. Even in Seattle, he lined up as a receiver once, which is crazy. So I feel like he's a good fit for Gase's system because he's athletic and zone read and all that type of stuff. But it's it worries me because he's more comfortable on the left side, and we're going to probably have him on the right side. So you never know. That's definitely not a long-term answer at right tackle. So that definitely is my the position on the offensive line that I look at and I'm worried about the most. So yeah, so those are our starters. So before we get into the depth players, what are your initial thoughts on this starting 5 offensive linemen going into 2020
Yeah, I
compared
think
to last year?
Yeah, I definitely think it's much better. I mean, last year they were arguably the worst unit in the league. I don't know if I would call them above average, but I think they're somewhere towards the middle of the pack in terms of what their offensive line looks like, which is going to be a drastic improvement in seeing what Sam Darnold can really, do as a young quarterback.
Oh yeah, and Jets fans would take an average offensive line over what we had last year. So we're jumping for joy even for that. We're rooting for average, as sad as that is. So going into the depth side of things, so we're going to talk about the backup left tackle, who's going to be rookie Cameron Clark, who's a 4th-round pick. So what are your thoughts on him? And talk about that draft selection too.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting pick in the 4th round. I think he's someone who could even potentially move to guard at some point in the NFL, just because of his size. And I think that I wouldn't expect him to play all that much this year, but my guess would be that he's going to be a long-term kind of project player that they want to turn into a guard, whether it be on the left side or the right side, taking over for Van Roten or Lewis or somebody like that. But I think they're trying to groom him to be a starter one day.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I love that draft selection. When we first got him, I wasn't really too familiar about him, so I did my homework on him, and I saw that tape against Clemson he had, and that's what you want to see. If you're going to a small school like that, he's not going against good competition, but it went against Clemson, and he was throwing people around. He looked like he belonged in a game like that. So he has the traits, and like you said, I think he's going to eventually slide into that interior position and maybe be a long-term answer at left guard. And him and Becton on the left side does sound scary to me, and I love that. So hopefully he can develop behind Becton, and them two can have that rookie bond, and he can be another depth player for years to come. So
Yeah.
going to the backup left guard position, we got Josh Andrews. He's a swing. He can be center or left guard. I just threw him in at left guard. So what are your thoughts on that depth signing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really expect him to play unless there's an injury. I think it's fine for, bringing in depth. We're all for, or my perspective anyway, with how bad the unit was last year, get as many bodies in here as possible to create competition and get as much talent in here. So that's really what Joe Douglas was doing, and I'm completely fine with that as someone who, can play either of the interior offensive lineman positions.
Yeah, he's a versatile guy. Joe Douglas always talks about versatility. You need to be able to play multiple positions, and that's what Josh Andrews can do. And me and you can both figure on this. Hopefully, he doesn't see the field, so that means there's no injuries. But yeah, like you said, the more people on this position, the better, because this is definitely the weakest position for us, and honestly, the most important position for this offense moving forward. So
100%.
moving into the center position, backing up Connor McGovern is going to be Jonathan Harrison, and he filled in last year, and he played decent. So what are your thoughts on him as a backup?
Yeah, I think he's a really good backup. I would say that he's a bottom tier starting caliber center, but in terms of backup, I think he's fine. That's probably if he's like your 5th or 6th offensive lineman, you're in good shape. So I'm completely fine with him being as the backup. They upgraded, which I was looking for them to do at the center position, and Harrison being here for depth again. I'm cool with it. I'm completely fine with it.
Same. I remember going into free agency, I saw Harrison, and I was a little worried. Does Douglas see a lot in Harrison? Is he going to be our starting guy? Luckily, he did not see that in him, so he's going to be our backup, and Connor McGovern will be the starter. He filled in last year. He played decently. I mean, Ryan Khalil was a nightmare. We just took him out of retirement. I understand the move. We were in desperate need. Joe Douglas didn't have an offseason, so he had to do something. But yeah, so quality depth player, backup center. Moving into the right guard, this is an interesting name for us Jets fans, Brian Winters. So what are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, I think he's someone who's probably going to be a cut candidate just because of how much the Jets could save if they cut him. I believe it's like upwards of $7 million, and he has a zero dead cap hit. So you'd basically be gaining, $7 to $8 million against the cap to go out and sign somebody better. I think with what Joe Douglas was able to do in free agency, you kind of made him expendable. So I wouldn't be surprised if he's not on the roster to start the year.
Yeah, going into when the roster cuts were starting to happen, Brian Winters was definitely one of those guys I looked at because we would save 7.5 million or something like that. And last year, he played okay. We find out that he was battling an injury and played through it. And Joe Douglas in an interview was raving about how much he loved Winters. And all Jets fans are listening to Douglas say that. We're like, okay, like, we're not too. Winters has been on the Jets for how long now? Like 4 years, 3 or 4 years. He's been a solid rock at that right guard position. But I like how we got an upgrade, and Greg Van Roten will be starting at right guard, and Winters will provide depth. And eventually, I can definitely see, like you said, him getting cut in the near future. And there's definitely still names out there like Larry Warford from Saints that we can look at. So, yeah, that's Brian Winters. And then moving into the last name on this offensive line for the Jets is backup right tackle Chuma Edoga. So what are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, for me, I'm really not that high on Chuma Edoga. I thought he kind of got exposed, especially when he played on the left side. I think he's okay on the right side, but I'd rather have somebody better there. If he's a backup, I think he's fine, but I wouldn't really necessarily feel comfortable with him as a starter just yet. So I'm okay with him in a backup role.
Yeah, I agree with you there. He's definitely a tackle that I look on this Jets roster. I don't see too much promise long term. If anything, he'll be the backup right tackle for years to come. And maybe he can develop behind George Fant, because George Fant, even though he's not great, he's learned behind good guys in Seattle. He understands the game. And also he like just started playing football, George Fant. So he's still learning the game too. So hopefully he can learn behind Chuma Doga. And when Chuma did come in last year at right tackle, there were some games where he got exposed. And in that one game I remember against the Cowboys, he like really held on to DeMarcus Lawrence pretty well. And I'm pretty sure he battled him and played a good game. So there was a lot of bad and some good from Chuma. There's a little bit of potential, but I'm not too high on him either. So yeah, that does it for all the individual players. And to end off this video, we'll just talk about our overall thoughts of the project. What will we project from this offensive line in 2020? Your expectations. I know we said they're average, but how is the running game going to look compared to the pass game? Which one's going to be better? Is Le'Veon going to be flourishing? Is Sam Darnold going to be getting sacked? So like, just get into all that type of stuff if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely think Le'Veon Bell is going to be happy with the line in front of him. I mean, that line did him no favors. My thing is, I don't know how much of a better season Le'Veon is going to have, not because of talent level or the line, but because of how Adam Gase uses him. I don't know if he's using him to the proper potential and what he really has. So I think that the situation around him is definitely better. I'm just curious to see how he's utilized by the coach. But ultimately, I think the run blocking game should be much, much improved. And in terms of passing, I mean, if we're giving Sam Darnold time, it's gonna make all the difference in the world, because a lot of his bad decisions comes when he, panicked, when there was pressure in his face. We saw it all game long against the Patriots on the Monday night game. Yeah. And he looked awful. And for whatever reason, they never adjusted. They just kept running empty sets, and there was pressure in his face the entire night, and he crumbled. And I mean, the kid, he's only 22 years old. I think people forget that sometimes when thinking about Sam Darnold. He's been in the league now going into his third year. He's just going to be 23 this year. So, I definitely think he's going to take a step forward, and a big reason for it is because of the improved offensive line play.
Yeah, I agree. I think the running game for the Jets compared to the passing game, offensive line-wise, will be definitely a big upgrade, because Mekhi Becton is more of a run-dominant type of guy. I mean, we're hoping he can develop into a pass-protecting left tackle, but I feel like the one thing that worries me about this offensive line is just the way the world is right now. The whole virtual meetings. Is the offensive line going to be able to meet and gel? Because it's a lot of new names on that line. I'm pretty sure there's 4 new starters if we're including Alex Lewis. So there's 4 new guys on this line, and they're all going to have to really gel. And the biggest component of offensive line is communication and chemistry. So hopefully they're in virtual meetings right now, like we are, talking, getting to know each other and all that type of stuff. So all we can do now is hope for the best and hope there's even a season on time, week 1 against the Bills, right?
Yeah, absolutely, man. I need football. I need something back in my life, sports-wise.
All right, Matt. So I really appreciate you joining my channel for the series. And if you guys have not checked out Matt's channel, make sure you do. He posts great Jets content. And like I said earlier, I'll leave his channel in the link down in the description below. And if you guys are new to my channel, you hit that subscribe button. I'm posting a bunch of videos of me breaking down each position. I've done the cornerbacks, the linebackers, the running backs, and the wide receivers, and now the offensive line. So with that being said, I hope you guys have a great day. let's go Jets. Peace out, Matt. Good talking to you, man.
All right, thanks, man. That was awesome.